Climate change is an undeniable part of everyday life now. For those in my generation, it and its effects have been a part of our lives ever since we were born, and this will only continue to be the case for every subsequent generation. In this short documentary, I will be exploring what the lives of those generations who will have to live with climate change will look like and what can be done to improve those lives. As Byron Williston outlines in his book, The Ethics of Climate Change is very much an intergenerational ethical issue. A present generation, ours for instance, might be living high on the hog with respects to its emissions and the consumption patterns that produce them. In what sense is it in the interest of this generation to curb its consumption? If it did so, it would be incurring a pure cost, the benefits being passed on entirely to a people of the future. The same logic applies to a future generation suffering the ravages of climate change. As bad as things are for that generation, they would presumably be made worse by the decision to cut carbon emissions. For this generation too, such cuts would constitute a pure cost, with benefits being enjoyed entirely by people of their future. What Williston is saying is that it will ultimately be the hardest for the generation that chooses to act on climate change, but they will be the ones responsible for the most amount of good entering the world. The same, though, applies for the opposite course of action. If we continue to fall victim to the current effects of climate change and not take any efforts to prevent them, every generation will have to burn more fossil fuels in order to cope with climate change disasters, thereby not just passing on the same problem to the succeeding generation, but make it even worse for them. Ethically then, it seems we have an obligation to deal with climate change. For if we do, the maximum amount of good will be brought into the world, and if we don't, potentially the maximum amount of suffering will, for every generation of humans to come. In the book Living with Climate Change, edited by Trevor M. Letcher, several ways to live with climate change are outlined, primarily focused on alternative means of energy as the largest factor. The final chapters of the book identify photovoltaic power, geothermal energy, hydropower, nuclear energy, wind energy, and hydrogen technology. Although there are upsides and downsides to each of these alternatives, it is ultimately argued that the switch to these forms of power and energy are more beneficial than relying on fossil fuels. For example, hydrogen is identified as a potential new low and zero carbon energy carrier for transport and building sectors. This is despite of the properties of hydrogen present technical requirements and constraints which add complication to the adoption of hydrogen technologies. It is also identified that additional resources will be at an increased demand, for example, rare metals and minerals. A whole host of challenges arises from this, although, as Simon M. Jowett optimistically writes, all of these challenges are opportunities. Elaborated further by saying, this transition to a more carbon-neutral future driven by low and zero CO2 energy generation, storage, and transport is already occurring. This makes it a precedent to understand these changes and to act and plan accordingly, especially given the long lead-in times relating to the vast majority of mineral exploration and mining projects that are needed to supply the metals and minerals that will form the backbone of the development of circular economies and a carbon-neutral future. So, the prospect of renewable energy appears to be the way through, but how is this actually achieved? Both Williston and the authors featured in Living with Climate Change appear to agree on this. Williston writes that the amount of money the rich would have to pay to fix the problem of climate change is not onerous. It is a tiny portion of global GDP and is therefore a reasonable burden to place on them. Developed countries should not therefore oppose meaningful measures to address climate change on the grounds they are too costly. What becomes clear upon examining both the ethical and scientific side is that this issue is one of humanity. We stand at a point where the solutions are right in front of us, and although it is easier to push it off and say that the next generation will deal with it, we have the opportunity to be the generation that fixes climate change, and not merely another one that perpetuates it. The choices made today will not only shape the planet we will inhabit, but the ancestors we will become.